Dr. Ayton is a consultant psychiatrist working for the Trust in Oxford, who has a special interest in eating disorders. My understanding is you've worked both with children and adolescents and with adults in that capacity. Right, yeah. Is that right? Agnes, you also have a role with the Eating Disorders faculty of the college and an administrative role with this special interest group as well. And I noted also that you have a higher degree in medical leadership, which is probably about right for this stage in the afternoon. So, Agnes, you're going to talk about including evolutionary science in the MRCPsych curriculum. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation from Riyadh, who organized this conference, which has been exciting all day. I thought it was very important to address why the neuroscience curriculum should be based on evolutionary science. As we have discussed, we have a crisis in psychiatry, and this is mainly the result of incompatible schools of thought that cannot be integrated or can even be openly hostile to each other. And we have had some discussions about this earlier today. We desperately need an integrative theoretical framework which can be the foundation of modern psychiatry. To address this crisis, our president has announced revision of the postgraduate curriculum, acknowledging that we are lagging behind some of the new developments that have happened in neuroscience over the recent years. And Wendy Byrne, who is leading on this project with Gareth, who is kindly attending the session, stated that the finished product of the curriculum has to be that it contains modern neuroscience, relates to clinical practice, is considered useful by trainees and trainers, and incorporates the examination syllabus. When I was reading this, I thought, which we have already seen this quote today, that actually neuroscience is part of biology, and as such it's based on evolutionary principles. And Dobzhansky's statement, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, very much applies to neuroscience as well. In fact, if we look at the Nobel Prizes over the last 50 years, and actually since yesterday, the last 51 years, an understanding of evolution was necessary in 47 of the 51 cases, and the other 3 were around imaging studies and genetic technology. And examples of these Nobel Prizes include neuroscientific topics, general medicine, infection, immunology, and there is one in behavioral studies, obviously, by Tim Bergen and his colleagues. Kind of going back to the origins of the evolutionary theory, we all know that the foundation was laid down by Charles Darwin in England, so we're in a good country to take up the baton. And his first book, The Origin of Species, was published 157 years ago. He further explored the origin of mankind in the descent of man and selection in relation to sex. In this book, he very bravely stated that my object is to show that there is no fundamental difference between man and higher mammals in their faculties. And I think that's sort of quite, well, obviously it was very advanced for his age, but it's still quite difficult to accept. So, for example, if we use the examples I used around the Nobel Prizes, we would readily accept that the biochemical or physiological mechanisms are similar across different species, but when it comes to behavior or emotional functioning, then it is a lot more contentious. The expression of emotion in man and animals, in contrast with Professor Nessie, is one of my favorite books, and actually this got me into getting interested in this topic. And in fact, I read it pretty much straight after I passed MRCPsych. So that was the first book I read when I was actually able to read something which I regarded as interesting. And sorry, and I was amazed that this body of knowledge was never actually mentioned in our curriculum, because this was really the first scientific study of the significance of the expression of the emotions in an evolutionary framework. Obviously, a lot has happened since, but it was the basis of what we are talking about now. It became the foundation of ethology and evolutionary psychology almost 100 years later, and I would like to argue that it also should be regarded as one of the foundations of modern psychiatry, as most psychiatric disorders present themselves with disturbed emotions or a difficulty recognizing emotions. So I think it's important. Anyway, we talked a lot about the implications of evolutionary theory, and I think I will be probably repeating some of the things that other speakers have said previously, but hopefully a bit of repetition won't harm anyone. So one of the first point is that evolution is about carrying an advantage that ensures successful reproduction. That evolution is a law of nature like gravity. And I think that's where sometimes we get into difficulties, that evolutionary theory is called a theory, and then people think, well, it's just a theory and there is no evidence. Over the last 157 years, we have amassed a huge amount of evidence to support that evolution is a law of nature. That every living thing is a result of this process, and human beings are not exempt, but the result of this. And we share our biology, including behaviors, with other animals and living things. And the main difference, I mean, we kind of keep moving the goalpost on that one, because when I went to school, we said, well, the main difference was bipedalism and tool use and all that sort of stuff. And then what it looks like at the moment, that we definitely have a relatively larger brain than other animals, and that we have a longer postnatal development, which allows more flexible adaptation to the environment. And maybe because of that, more things can go wrong. One of the things I really like about Darwin, that he is one of the few scientists since the 19th century whose original ideas have stood the test of time, and in fact have blossomed into the science of modern evolutionary biology. So this is Darwin's original sketch about the tree of life, and this is where we are at the moment. And it's probably not finished as a project. So in terms of thinking about developments over the last 150 years, there have been massive developments, so I can't really list everything that's happened. And I was just thinking that we have seen an acceleration of knowledge and the emergence of scientific studies Darwin could have only dreamt of at the time. And this includes things like modern ethology, all the molecular biology and the technology kind of underpinning that, statistics, computer technology, internet, mobile technology. I mean, some of the research Professor Dunbar has been doing is very much dependent on this technology, and it wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago. And neuroimaging studies. And the advances of these have actually resulted in increasing sophistication of evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology. Again, just when I was preparing for this talk, I kind of realized how much has happened in the last 20 years since I became interested in this. And it's a bit of a kind of embarrassing thing to confess, because as you work as a jobbing psychiatrist, you don't necessarily follow the literature as much. However, I think that we have a very strong case to include these evolutionary concepts such as inclusive fitness, parental investment, and so on into the curriculum, so that the new generation of psychiatrists are aware of these concepts and they can build on them in the future. I suppose I wanted to bring a few examples because it's quite easy to simplify and misunderstand what evolutionary biology means. And I thought it would be helpful to look at one example of evolutionary biology in action is the increasing understanding of the microbiome and the significance of the microbiome for all organisms. So evolution doesn't actually happen in isolation, because we sometimes kind of think, well, it's about survival of the fittest or mate selection or whatnot. It is actually a complex interaction between the environment and various organisms, and can result in health or disease. So again, and this is a good recent summary, and one of the many examples of the significance of the microbiome is actually you produce 90% of your serotonin in your gut. So that would explain, for example, why it is that my patients who have anorexia nervosa don't respond to antidepressants, because maybe there is an abnormality over there. So again, it seems to me that it's directly relevant to us. And this is another example. I mean, during my lifetime, which is kind of getting longer and longer, I'm afraid, we have seen evolution in action. As a result of the widespread antibiotic use, resistant microbes have emerged. And in the 20th century, we thought, and I remember when I was in school, that humans won the evolutionary arms race, but now the microbes are fighting back just as a result of natural selection. And unless we change the environment that favors antibiotic resistance, we'll have a new public health disaster in a not too distant future. So my point about this line, that medicine can only ignore evolution at its peril, that we can't actually ignore evolution. Okay, so how is this relevant to psychiatry? So I was sort of thinking, would we say that gravitational theory is not relevant to aircraft engineering? It is the same sort of a situation. I'd like to argue that an evolutionary understanding of human behavior is the same importance for our specialty as the understanding of the gravitational theory for aircraft engineers. They need to work with gravity to fly a plane safely. So they may not be kind of thinking about gravity all the time, but it's underpinning the whole of the job. We as psychiatrists need to understand human behaviors not just in the present, but also in the evolutionary context. Going back to Tim Bergen, I think it's very difficult to leave out Tim Bergen. But I mean, ethology, modern ethology has made fantastic contribution to the understanding of evolution of behavior. And Tim Bergen obviously was one of the prominent people contributing to the field. And the most important thing is to to think about the origins of behaviors, not just in an approximate that how does it work, but also in an ultimate framework. Traditionally, psychiatry is mainly interested in the first proximate question, how does something work? And I suppose that's the danger with the neuroscience science curriculum, that we will continue focusing on just how things work. I noticed that when we talked about the audience and who's interested in evolutionary psychiatry, that we have an overrepresentation of child and adolescent psychiatry trained members like myself. And I suppose that's probably because child psychiatrists have a stronger developmental training than some of the general psychiatrists. But I suppose we also need to think about what is the behavior for and how did it evolve. And again, Professor Nassi has made this point very well. So this is a recent article looking at this framework and using one example of a bird song, which is quite well explored. So if I just go through this, so the first proximate question, how does it work? Researchers have amassed a good understanding of the neuroscientific basis of the bird song. What is it for? It is well known that the utility of the bird song is attracting mates and warning rivals or warning each other of predators. So it has both of a survival and a reproductive value. In terms of development, experimental work has shown that birds learn their song during sensitive phases of development. And if the bird is reared in isolation, then this process is damaged for life. And in terms of evolution, the comparative analysis of bird song have shown the songs vary according to phylogenetic lines, and have also shown of cultural transmission of songs. And I suppose that kind of culture goes back to that far in evolution is actually really quite important a discovery. A similar framework would add much to our understanding of human emotions and behavior and their abnormalities. And I suppose we could be thinking about these aspects of human emotions and behavior, for example, when we're exploring aggression or understanding grief or depression, etc. So what can learning about evolutionary theory offer to the future generation of psychiatrists? It can offer the integrative theoretical framework. It can help understanding universal human development, behaviors, emotions, etc. And it can also offer a theoretical platform to understand variation, including gender and pathology. And Professor Baron Cohen's talk was a good example of understanding variation and the importance of variation in pathology. And it should also offer a theoretical framework for new treatments, and I will come back to that. Okay. So I thought it would be helpful to bring some practical examples. And one of the sort of striking things is that current psychiatry training doesn't explore gender differences. So when we prepare for our exam, we have some MCQs, and for example, in autism, there's a 4-to-1 male-female ratio, and then you have to learn that. And in my own specialty in eating disorder, there is an extreme 10-to-1 female-to-male ratio, but there is nothing actually in the literature, why that might be. In evolutionary biology or evolutionary psychology, sexual dimorphism is a well-recognized feature of pretty much all living things. And they have explored the differences between the sexes. And I would like to argue that for the future generation of psychiatrists, we need to understand things like sexual selection, intersexual competition, which obviously Riyadh has done some work on, and actually probably you are the only person who's done any work on. So well done, thank you. And differing parental investments. The other practical example is understanding the risk of homicide and child abuse. So inclusive fitness is an important concept which was described by Hamilton and then was publicized by Richard Dawkins' famous book of the selfish gene. And it means that the reproductive unit is the individual gene, and therefore related individuals have an investment of the survival of their kin. So whether we like it or not, homicide and child abuse statistics show that the mechanisms seem to apply to humans as well. And I suppose the evolutionary framework doesn't carry a moral judgment, it just describes a phenomenon that exists. And again, I think it's important for the next generation of psychiatrists to be aware of this. I suppose thinking about other practical implication, prevention and treatment, thinking about ultimate causes of behavior can actually inform public prevention strategies. So for example, the obvious example would be a good understanding of childhood development in an evolutionary context. So you probably shouldn't expect kind of 5 years old to sit for 6 hours and concentrate, and you probably should be trying to teach them a second language before they are 7, because that's the sensitive phase of learning. So I suppose the evolutionary theory has a lot of practical implications already, and I'm sure that there is a lot more potential to come. In terms of psychological treatments, I suppose whatever psychological treatments we use, they need to be compatible with an evolutionary understanding of cognition behavior, and that's probably kind of quite a big topic I can't go into much detail into, but Professor Gilbert, for example, developed compassion-focused therapy, which is based on attachment theory. And I also think, and I don't know whether anyone else has noticed that interpersonal therapy is actually wonderfully compatible with evolutionary theory, despite the fact that it was developed completely parallel. So that's sort of quite interesting. I also thought that given the fantastic work that Professor Dunbar has done about endogenous opiates and reward systems and general kind of human well-being, actually we need to take non-verbal therapies a little bit more seriously, so like music, dance and social contacts, etc. And to be fair, there are some examples of that. There is reasonably good evidence that music therapy helps in depression, and obviously non-verbal therapies have been used with certain patient populations such as depression and dementia, but this is an area of potential development. Right. So what's in the current curriculum? The syllabic curriculum, for those who are not initiated, means the exam curriculum, because there is a bit of a discrepancy between the clinical curriculum and the exam curriculum, and that's one of the sort of tasks to try to coordinate that. So there's absolutely nothing about evolutionary theory, and I thought to kind of put this up. So basic psychology, learning theory, motivation, emotion, you can't really do that without evolutionary theory, can you? Well, you obviously could do that 50 years ago, but not now.
Lots of rots, no idea why they're in what order they are.
Yes. Similarly, social psychology, I mean, so much informed by evolutionary theory over the last 20 years, and fantastic high-quality research coming out. So I suppose what I'm kind of trying to say or demonstrate that quite a lot of it is already there without mentioning evolution. And in fact, Bowlby's attachment theory is there without mentioning evolution, which I'm sort of thinking, really, how? How is that possible? So I guess, and molecular genetics, I mean, again, molecular genetics, looking at my daughter who's done a PhD, is that possible to do without evolution? No.
How do you do genetics without evolution?
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Okay, so what's happening in related sciences? So I think I can say that with a high confidence. I don't think that there are any biological courses, kind of university courses, without evolution. So that is just a given. And it's quite interesting that sort of contradiction, that as long as you're kind of talking about objects and not talking about feelings, then it's okay. Even in the States, I would imagine. But the evolutionary psychology departments are increasing in number worldwide, and we have one obviously in Oxford, but we have a number of others in the country, Brunel University, Glasgow, etc. And there is a huge amount of experimental work and research going on. So there are hypotheses, but the hypotheses are being tested. So it's not just so stories when people kind of come up, well, cavemen used to do this or used to do that, and therefore that must be true. The field has moved on. There have been calls for including evolutionary science into undergraduate medicine by Professor Nessie, and also by the World Psychiatric Association. There's been a case kind of made that actually evolutionary theory has much to offer for psychiatry. But we still haven't got an evolutionary psychiatry department or curriculum yet. Having said that, given that we are in England / UK, I don't know anymore, given the strong tradition in evolutionary theory and evolutionary sciences, I think we're in a very good place to take the lead. And I would be interested in Professor Nessie's view on that. So I think the time is right. We have an opportunity because the college is revising the curriculum, and the field has developed a lot over the last, particularly 20 years. So summary. So the developments in modern evolution science can offer a much needed integrative framework for psychiatry, and we desperately need that, and that was a common theme amongst all the speakers today. And therefore an understanding of evolution sciences is essential for the future generation of psychiatrists. And that is really a foundation for them to ask the right questions, to design future research. I can't sort of claim, and I don't think anyone wants to claim, that we have all the answers, but I think kind of having that framework is essential. And this can be part of basic sciences underpinning existing topics in the light of evolution biology, ethology, and evolutionary psychology. And I kind of put it in the critical reading paper because we have a critical reading paper which mainly looks at clinical trials, so whether we should kind of widen out the critical reading paper to a different topic that would be up for discussion. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Agnes, thank you very much. I wonder if there are any questions about the issue of the curriculum and medical education for training psychiatrists. Lord Allardyce.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I'd I'd like to say about it. The first is that evolutionary psychiatry is one of the casualties of the big split between the psychoanalytic world and the biological world. Because the initial approach of psychoanalysis was very much evolutionary in its tone, both in terms of individual development and in terms of societal development and physical and biological development. And one of the consequences of the split is that neither did psychoanalysis mature in its development, nor did the biological approach to science. So bringing an evolutionary approach in has the capacity to actually resolve some of these problems and learn from the various different approaches. That's the first thing. The second thing, which is a problem for us as psychiatrists, and I'll talk about the flip side in a second, is we work with individual people in the main. Sometimes we work with families. Very occasionally we work with communities. But evolution is not an individual development. There's the individual development ontologically of the individual, which is important. But evolution as a whole is something that happens without just, it's not just one person that develops. It's, and of course an important part of that is societal and cultural evolution. The people who could help us most with this are the anthropologists. But the problem is the anthropologists have an absolute allergy to changing anything. Their idea is you go and observe, but for goodness sake, don't change it. Now, absolutely fine. I'd be delighted if we have an anthropologist, well, we have some, but an anthropologist in the main who wants to change. There's a real, and I speak as somebody who is involved with the anthropology department at Oxford, amongst other things. And of course, if you don't change things, it's very difficult to demonstrate that the theory that you had actually stands up. So there's work we need to do as psychiatrists to understand the relevance of large group processes, because that's not what we work on most of the time. And it's important to engage with our anthropological colleagues who mostly work with large groups, but not for the purpose of making changes in those. And without that, there's a problem in development. Now, the final thing I'd say is this. The group of people who are here are very interested and committed, and this is really a very important thing. That's good, and it's vitally important. But it's also very important not to treat evolution in a religious way. Yeah. That it becomes a doctrine we are determined to be evangelical about. Rather to say this is an important component of science, and we must try to understand. Because some of the things that Darwin was saying, for example, that there's no difference in the way that human beings think. Actually, there are capacities that we have developed socially and individually which have gone beyond where some of the rest of our cousins are. And we need to understand that as well. Don't forget, he had also a political agenda in what he was doing. He wanted to combat racism in what he was doing, which was a very commendable thing.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry, yes, Professor Nassi.
So I'd like to just congratulate you for taking this all to the next stage, because I think this is going to be even more important than what we've all done here today. And I'd like to say just a few words about what others of us have done to try to lay the groundwork for this, to encourage you. Maybe should I just stand up? Yeah, I'll just join you up here for a moment.
Right.
And if you could go back a few slides. I thought one of your slides was very wonderful. So I think this is the future that's going to make the law a big difference. And I'd like to see if we can organize ourselves to do it as effectively as possible. Yes, you picked the right slide. That's right. Empathy.
Yeah.
So I've talked with people for years now about how to do this, and we've come to a consistent conclusion. I spent a whole year at the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin. We're talking to people about how do we get evolution into doctors, and we've always concluded you can't do it in medical schools. It's too late. You've got to do it even before. So that's principle number one, is let's get them when they're really young. And that applies, for psychiatric training, it needs to be in the residency at least. And for the people who are sensible enough and creative enough to be senior and interested, congratulations. And we need to try to inspire younger people. Strategy-wise, presenting ourselves as alternatives to neuroscience is hopeless, because it's so dominant and rich. They are presenting themselves as religious. They have a special fund to get neuroscience into the curriculum, correct? We don't have any special funding to get it into the curriculum. And I think what we must do is emphasize that neuroscience is or should be evolutionary itself.
Yeah.
And I think we can, instead of saying we need to add things into this, learning theory needs to be informed by evolution based on Seligman and all of the kinds, all of the research that shows that learning is not a generalized process, it's been shaped by natural selection. Motivational theory in evolutionary context, emotion in evolutionary context is essential. Aggression, altruism is the core focus of study of many of us who study evolution. The whole nature and nurture problem should go out the window, except the fact that it doesn't go out the window has to do with deep structures in our mind that have it keep coming up again. So anyway, I'll keep this simple. And as for attachment theory, you know, there's all this new stuff about how supposedly abnormal kinds of attachment might in fact be useful in certain circumstances, something that we, and then finally to go back to your point about psychoanalysis, you know, I've gotten in such trouble for writing 2 papers about psychodynamics and psychoanalysis and evolutionary perspective. The psychoanalyst didn't like it because it was talking about the utility of repression and defenses, and all of the neuroscientists said, oh, you've gone over to the dark side, Randy, what's wrong with you? So, but I think if we augment these things instead of fighting them, that's probably what you're going to do already, right?
Well, that's why I included them here, and I absolutely agree, and thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you very much. Just a few points. I want to emphasize a couple of things that John has mentioned. I think the link with anthropology is really, really important, and I think that needs to be a strategic thing. And our colleague earlier was saying that language was too complex, confused things. I think that's wrong. We need to be thinking of thin description and thick description of human life and events. With our patients, we need thick description. What's going on in detail? Like women talk with each other and create networks that men don't have. I think that's really important and scientific. The other thing I was going to say is I wonder, sitting here today and listening to Randy earlier on, I think we should change the name, not Evolutionary Psychiatry, but at least for the curriculum purpose, say Evolution Science in Psychiatry.
Yeah.
I think that will bring us closer to the neuroscientists, but also to the anthropologists who are scientists. They are not any less scientists than the other. And the third thing is to think, who will be teaching this stuff? Who is around to teach?
Just a thought while it's moving, that maybe part of the difficulty is that the business of psychiatry is to some extent teleological. I mean, we're in the business of curing people, inverted commas, or resolving problems and taking things forward for individual people. Whereas one can apply mechanistic explanations of disease, such as neuroscience, and Nick Craddock's appeal to us to all become neuroscientists fits very well with that. It's more difficult to see quite how we do that with evolution, given the history of the misuse of evolution in order to achieve certain outcomes. And what we've heard about today is an awful lot about the way evolution can help explain and help us to understand how we get where we are. There's another issue about where we go from here, and I suppose the sort of danger that we end up being, as it were, viewed as having a kind of political agenda of some sort about people and society and so forth. And I suppose that anxiety is somewhere in there, isn't it? And maybe that's partly what we're up against, I would have thought. But
can I sort of contradict you? Because
yeah,
I'm sort of thinking, well, why, just going back to the slide, the Tim Bergen slide, that one. I mean, why are we saying that it's only the mechanism that is important? I mean, obviously, in child psychiatry, we take it for granted that we need to understand the development, but there isn't very good sort of coordination between the two things. And we need to think about utility, or we need to think about what is the purpose of a behavior, and then you made a wonderful case about emotions, for example, and I suppose how it kind of fits in with evolution. Why is there any different from kind of trying to find, trying to learn the absolute minute details of various receptors?
I don't think it's
because you don't use the various receptors in your clinical practice either. You have a theoretical knowledge base that helps with your understanding.
Yeah.
So have I missed something?
The science is morally equivalent, as it were, whichever of Tinbergen's boxes you're working in. I suppose it's how people perceive the longer term objective or something like that. Maybe this is where we need an anthropologist.
The two things that I'd say about anthropology, one is what it has to offer is we're looking at people in context. A lot of psychology became very experimental. You take people out of the context to try to find the norms. In anthropology, you're going into the communities and trying to look at people as social beings, which is generally what we're coming up against when we're looking at mental health issues. We're looking at people within a social context who are struggling. So I think anthropology can bring that in. Also, anthropology, again, looks at diversity. So the kind of neurodiversity program that's coming through, but it helps us look at diversity. In terms of applied anthropology, there's a huge split within, I'm an evolutionary anthropologist. There are people who will not talk to me and who consider me the devil, right, within anthropology. Not that I'm practicing. But there are most anthropologists I know who are doing the more evolutionary stuff and quantitative stuff actually really care about applying the stuff. There was a conference 2 years ago in Bristol supported by the Evolution Human Behaviour Group on applied evolutionary anthropology, out of which came a very expensive Springer book, as all Springer books are. But people working on fertility and it's mostly being applied in the world of development and fertility. But there is actually a real hunger among nearly every anthropologist I know to make their work applied. And I think part of the problem is the fear from the whole eugenics and the history of is from ought. So anthropologists have been nervous from that and don't want to get, especially the evolutionary ones, don't want to get tarnished with that brush. But I think but people wouldn't know how to bring it into this world. The people that I know who aren't specifically interested in mental health but who have something relevant that they might be able to offer wouldn't have a clue who to write for, how to bring it into this world. So, but there is a hunger, in anthropology and in the evolutionary anthropology for it to be applied. And nearly everyone I know who's working in that field, people looking at play from that perspective, are all getting into kind of education and play and mental health. So there are people who are doing that in quite a wide scale. Whether the kind of classic Oxford anthropologists are, they got rid of biological anthropology at Oxford, so it's a problem. But Stan Juliacek probably is in that department. He's a health person. So yes, I think there's a context to anthropology, and we live in a Western culture, and that is our culture, and we don't have extended families and all of that. But again, we have to kind of accept that that's not what all humans do. And I think anthropology brings in a perspective that can hold some of the understanding. So as I was given the floor, my 2 cents worth as an anthropologist.
Thank you.
To talk about culture and things like race, I think it's very important that this is not about racism or culturism or something like that. And let's take a medical example. Rickets, vitamin D deficiency, skin cancer. Now, there's no right or wrong skin colour. People that traditionally came from near the equator had a higher incidence of genes which gave them darker skin with protection against sunlight. If we go to Australia or the tropics, the risk of getting skin cancer is much increased. Now, of course, culturally, and because of the environment, if people with dark skins go to the northern climes, they're at risk of vitamin D deficiency for very good medical reasons. Now, this is not about racism, this is not about discriminating on the basis of skin colour for prejudicial reasons. This is about us, in a way, being anti-Darwinian. Over generations, if there wasn't movement of peoples, people with dark skins living in Norway and Finland would probably die. And people with light skins would die early in the tropics. Now, being doctors, we oppose this. We give people sunblock, or we give them vitamin D, or we advise people not to cover themselves up, or to cover themselves up, not in a French burkini way, but there are consequences of culture, and these things are immensely complicated, and we're not there to tell people to wear burqas or not, but we need to understand the consequences of their behaviour, and we can mitigate against it by giving vitamin D or having vitamin D in margarine, butter, or whatever it is. And I think this is the important thing in a very much simpler model than anxiety or autism or depression. We need to think about these things and what the genes tell us. And when we just have these genetic studies with hundreds of genes, it's very good, but I was saying it's rocks in a quarry. Counting rocks in a quarry is great for correlations, but why are they there? Now, we've got an idea with skin colour and vitamin D and cancer, but I'm sure my medical colleagues will give me many more examples, not least of which is lactase persistence, of things that are really important in the genes, and that must apply to all the genes, but we just don't know it. And how many genes are there? 25,000 operating, so we've got quite a few to go through, and of course they're operating together. But we've got to start somewhere, surely. And we've got to bring in the cultural as well with this, as how is that operating, and the medical, how we can counter that when it's to people's disadvantage. Anyway, that's my tuppenny worth on culture.
Someone asked the question about why is it that Europeans tend to have lactase persistence and also a higher level of alcohol dehydrogenase, especially compared to people from East Asia, and why, and yet that they're on different areas of the chromosome, different chromosomes. So someone said, well, it's a choice thing that in ancient times drinking water was potentially lethal. So in East Asia, the choice was to boil water and use leaf infusions to add taste, whereas in Europe, the choice was to ferment it and use alcohol to kill the bugs, and that's why Europeans have greater alcohol dehydrogenase. So there's a element of culture and evolution working in parallel.
Do read my summary paper 2013, a lot of which is actually based on Professor Ness's, but also Sullivan and Hayden's work about these very issues, about substances and culture and survival.
Mm.
Actually, this is a very interesting example where it starts off simple and then it gets hard. In particular, I've long used the example of the inability to metabolize alcohol in East Asians as a good example, assuming that they were exposed to alcohol longer and they got protected against the dangers of alcoholism by those mutations. Until some damned anthropologists went and looked at the exact distribution of the difficulty in metabolizing alcohol, and it does not map all that well to use of alcohol. It maps better to some kind of fermented other kind of cabbage or something like that that is not an alcoholic drink at all. And so it might be that that whole hypothesis is actually not correct. Even lactase turns out to be curious. Mark Thomas spent that year in Berlin with me. He's a really talented geneticist at UCL, and he's done most of the work on lactase and metabolism. It turns out that it's not just that people in Northern Europe had cows, it is that people in Southern Europe had cows, and their populations grew so fast that they migrated north. So this is a great example. It's not just natural selection, it's migration carrying those genes north. And every single one of these needs, I keep being confident about things, and then I go into more depth and there's a whole other story.
But surely the point is it's interesting and it informs it.
But you got to keep digging for everyone.
And if we're in the sort of business of examples, Paul gave the example of vitamin D and skin color. The Inuit actually live in very high
latitudes and have dark skins. And the reason that that's the case is because they obtain their vitamin D from marine life rather than from sunlight. So, I think that these are live examples of how evolution and how selection can shape humans, shape human bodies, shape human minds, and it is, I think, necessary for trainees in psychiatry, and I would say even medical students, to be more aware of the fact that, Paul keeps saying that genes are there because they were selected, or maybe they drifted, or that there are other good evolutionary reasons why, but that's never mentioned. Genes are mentioned in a static manner, as if they were created in this way, and there is an ideal genome, and this is the way that things are, and have always been, which is obviously not the case. So I think we need to be vocal to make the case, and obviously you are our representative on this committee. We should provide you with every support that we can.
Yes,
whether we will be successful on this occasion, I don't know, but I think we should make a good effort. And thus far we've only been in existence for 10 months, and we seem to have a bit of a voice.
Can I just make one suggestion? Thank you very much for that. I quite like the suggestion of changing the name, actually. So can we call it Evolutionary Science in Psychiatry? Is that too complicated?
We should
discuss it on one.
Emulate Randy's title of his centre, Evolution and Medicine, into Evolution and Psychiatry. I don't know. I mean, that seems to be a simple thing, just adding to our title, rather than saying Evolutionary Psychiatry. We can say Evolution and Psychiatry.
I once started a course by giving examples based on genetic differences between human subpopulations, lactase and skin color. And I found that for the rest of the entire term of that course, that's what the students thought evolutionary medicine was all about. And they kept coming back to that. And so I would be cautious about using that, except in very small doses. Yes. Because once people get that idea, first of all, they think that's what it's all about. And second of all, they start thinking about racism.
Yes, I agree.
Well, that's why I was worried about mentioning skin colour. But I mean, there are other things like sickle cell and heterozygous advantage.
So
but
genetic differences between populations, you're in a whole contentious area, and it's very hard
Yeah.
for people to understand that you're not racist.
and you're being racially aware, not racist. But I mean, for instance,
Anthropologists will attack you for even saying there is such a thing.
well, I don't think. Yes, I'm with you all the way on that. But of course, with sickle cell, we are now getting people with so-called white skin with sickle cell because of cultural changes. Yeah.
The issue is that race is a socially constructed concept. Pigmented skin is a physical reality.
Yes. Exactly.
That's the difficulty. But because as human beings think in terms of socially constructed concepts all the time, because that's what we're evolved to do. So we're kind of making a rod for our own backs in a sense, aren't we? It's kind of us against Plato.
Which is why I was saying people that live near the equator and populations, it's about clines, I think was a better way of describing it, rather than race, of course, which applies to thalassemia, sickle cell, and so on. And that's the whole point. Anyway, but they are genetic differences and genetic issues which have meaning because of evolution. Or, Riyad's point is there, they just have occurred for no reason at all. They're just in the genome. And I think what we're trying to say is I don't want to get into sort of racism or all that. The whole point is why are they there? That's what we want to know.
Yes. I think the basic principle of what are the evolutionary processes, whether it's selection, or otherwise, that led to certain genes being more prevalent than others. And you know, it's a fact that genes are distributed and are you know, selected for various reasons.
And some of that is cultural.
And increase in frequency and reduce in frequency due to various evolutionary factors.
We don't think we want to be getting hung up on genes. If we're looking at things like an excessive anger, we're not going to be finding, you know, even if we do find genetic differences for anger, is that really interesting? What's interesting is what has anger evolved to do as a behaviour, or what has sadness evolved, or shame, or whatever it is evolved to do as a behaviour. And I think there's a danger of getting, kind of hooked into the genes because it's so biological and tangible. And in terms of the psychiatry, I think...
Well, you would have noticed, though, that I spoke about schizophrenia for half an hour without mentioning genes once.
No, I did, but just the way this is going in this bit.
I didn't mention the word genes at all. And sometimes, you know, the non-evolutionists would be shocked to say, what about genetics?
But the trouble is our syllabus has a lot about genes and neuropsychiatry, but not much about this.
Yes.
And so what I'm saying is that the perspective about the genes, which in a way we don't want to speak about in that depth, is lost without all the other bits being brought into it. But yes, we don't want to just talk about individual loci.
Anything else that you think would be helpful, Gareth, because you're obviously kind of starting out, kind of managing this project?
Well, we're still at a very early stage of the revision of the curriculum project, and it is that. It is not just rewriting the curriculum. It is a project. It's a 2-year project. Thank you. And as you know, Agnes, a lot of what we'll be doing in the first 6 months between now and the spring is listening.
Great.
Okay.
You know, it's very striking that Tinbergen's famous diagram, 4 questions, has cropped up, I think, in pretty well every presentation, and one almost wonders whether Tinbergen's conceptual framework might not be an approach to psychiatry which sort of underpins the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose if we could achieve that, I would be absolutely delighted.
Because it pays due, you know, it doesn't attempt in any way to supplant other areas of genesis of mental conditions. It simply amplifies the conceptual richness process. Another question?
I just wanted to pick up a little bit this concern about how the group may be interpreted, and I think it's absolutely right that we don't want to be coming across as a heavily biological in the sense of we're interested in just the hard neurosciences, because I think personally I believe that if we look at emotion, for example, we look upon emotion as being, or the negative emotions being indications of social adversity. Now that can be an individual social adversity, or it can be a large group or a cultural adversity. And so that throws up for me questions of have we got cultural mismatches? Are we unaware that we are actually developing as a society in ways that conflict with our earlier development, and so that getting negative emotions is much more likely? I mean, one thinks of things about, we were talking earlier about the ways in which our culture encourages people to become the best with expectations that you can be the best at everything, and clearly almost all of us are not going to succeed in that. And then you think of things like the increasing level of inequality within society that's strongly documented now. The way in which in ancestral times we compare ourselves to each other, not to some absolute. So there are all these aspects, it seems to me, that an evolutionary perspective can illuminate for us things that are important about our psychological development and the society we live in, that we should be able to reflect back to our community, and they will decide what they wish to do about it. But it seems to me it's part of our responsibility to reflect those things back to our community. We don't just function for individuals. We are knowledge carriers for the society of which we're members, and we need to feed back if we think that our society is going in maladaptive directions.
But this exercise itself is feeding back, because the whole project is about what we should be teaching our trainees, and so this is the kind of knowledge that we want to influence.
Yeah, I mean, my sort of understanding of the topic, and to be fair, I'm a jobbing psychiatrist, so I'm not an academic, and I thought 20 years ago that the field was never going to go anywhere, so I kind of stopped reading. So I'm absolutely delighted that we have this special interest group. But what I'm sort of thinking, very similar to what you were saying, Andrew, that we need to have a framework into the curriculum. We haven't got all the answers, and I think the answers will be developing over time. But unless our trainees have an understanding of the framework, they will not be asking the right questions, and the field will stagnate, and the psychologists are already taking over.
And I do take Professor Netz's point about perhaps oversimplifying things like skin colour or alcohol use, but you have to start somewhere. If you start with all the complexities at the top, you probably frighten everybody off.
No, actually, I didn't get that. So I would be interested in your experience, because I was kind of trying out this talk on my trainees, and they initially all started with kind of glazed over eyes, and they all woke up by then. So there is that sort of curiosity and hunger. What I have seen, I don't know, is that your experience?
Yeah, we've got a couple of minutes, so yeah.
It seems to me that I always get the sense that people think, well, how can we sell this to students? To me, they've been pushing this open door. They've been hungry for this because it underpins all the bricks, all the rocks on the list there. They're all done, I presume, biology. I did botany and zoology at school. I think they all do biology now. I can't believe a person who emerged from an A-level in biology.
But the trainees won't have much of a say in this, will they? Will there be trainee input into this process?
Yeah.
Yes, there will be. Yeah.
Significant?
There is trainee
significant input, or is it tokenistic?
Representation, both on the implementation and the commission.
I mean, my kind of vision of what happened is there are senior people in the college with a token trainee or two.
No, in fact, most of the people on the commission are not from college.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'm corrected.
George, did you want to just comment?
I think we need to answer 3 questions.
4. They have to be 4.
Okay. One is, what are trainees missing out that makes their practice worse?
Yes.
Second, what do we have to add that will make their practice better? And third, what do they need to know so that they can follow future research and developments? I think these are the ways in which we need to think. What is there's so much. What is it that will impact on future practice, learning, perhaps research for the few people that need it?
And could I answer George's question? Because I think, to me, the thing that they miss is something that helps to bring together the different components of their psychiatric understanding.
Yes.
Without that, what happens is they go down the pharmacological route with very little psychological, or they go down the psychotherapy route with very little pharmacological, or they muddle about with some kind of so-called eclecticism, which is just a bag of whatever you pull out, depending on the day of the week. And so to have some kind of understanding of things which gives value to all the components of human development is, I think, something that will be very helpful, and is something I don't think at the moment that they really get.
So I think we're probably, it's fairly obvious we could head for the pub and keep going till closing time. But we probably do need to stop. Some of us have got to get trains to distant parts of the country, and Can I? But I'm going to grab 30 seconds but you know, it strikes me that we've got immensely powerful explanatory concepts, and many of which have been touched on today, Agnes. And I know they were in some of your slides somewhere, and some of the ones that you may not have put up through lack of time. You know, so for example, kin selection. I never heard of kin selection until about 5 years ago. Neither had I heard of reciprocal altruism. So these powerful biological mechanisms, which shape human psychology, we don't need to worry about skin colour to deal with those issues. And I think there is a real anxiety. I have to say, I feel a little bit of a smoke detector coming on, Paul, at the very mention of skin colour, because I just think there's so much baggage, it's so difficult, isn't it? But at the same time, I think we have the duty to be scientifically honest, and it's a terribly difficult balance. But it's great we're grappling with these sort of ethical questions.
Grappling with it.
We're all grappling, absolutely. So I just, if I may just say, I think it's my job to thank the speakers today, all of whom have been marvellous, and to thank the organising committee, and I'm not going to go through names, you know who they all are, and to the college for hosting the event and providing tea and coffee and all the rest of it. Although it was a bit of a struggle, but we won't go into that. So I wish you a happy and pleasant journey home.
Thank you very much.